Hi there. Now in this video I want to talk to you about Chinese import regulations, especially when you're importing to the United States or the European Union, for example. Now both countries have different regulations, laws and legislations that differ from each other. Now I know maybe some of you are just starting out, and I know this can be a maze and this can be very confusing, and you don't know what is a LFGB certificate or what is a FCC certificate. And in this video, I want to break it all down to what does it actually mean for you as an importer when you're importing a product to your local country. Now I want to run you through a few points so that you get a better understanding what you need to do actually when you're first importing a product, or if you're already importing a product. For example, what country-specific requirements mean, what type of certifications are there, who issues these certifications, what is the cost of these certifications, or why do some importers have no certifications at all, but they still can sell it, for example, on Amazon. What does your product have to actually meet legally, where you can save some money, and so on. So let's dive right into it and get to the first point. Country-specific requirements. Now each country, doesn't matter if you're in the European Union or in the United States or in Canada, has different laws and legislations. So that means if you're importing a product to the United States, you have to have a certain certificate. But that doesn't mean this certificate is also valid for Canada or for France or for the UK. So they're all different. And I know this can get confusing, but bear with me, I'll explain in detail. So even though, for example, the European Union has general guidelines that are valid for all European countries, some of these countries can still have different legislations. For example, since Switzerland is not in the European Union, they have completely different regulations than, for example, a neighboring country such as Austria or Italy. Now, there are norms and regulations in the European Union, for example, or in the United States that apply to almost all countries. For example, the D2001/95/EC or General Product Safety Directive is valid for most of the countries in Europe. But for example, a GS certificate from Germany is not valid in Switzerland, as I said before. In Switzerland, it would be a S+ certification. Now, all you need to understand at this point for now is that each country has different requirements, and when you start looking into your product, you need to first look into your specific country requirement. Second, what type of certificates are there? First things first, certificates or test reports issued by a supplier in China are based on legislations and directives within your specific country. So for example, the GPSD or the General Product Safety Directive in the European Union, or the CPSA, the Consumer Product Safety Act in the US, basically states before you're importing a product into your country, you need to meet certain legislations and laws that are issued from this country. So that sounds simple, right? Unfortunately not. As for example, the GPSD has tons of directives under its belt. So for example, the CE directive or the REACH directive, the RoHS directive, the LFGB directive, and I could go on and on and on. So you need to understand that there is a general directive like the CPSA, the Consumer Product Safety Act in the US, but these also have sub-directives which you need to meet as an importer. So again, what type of certifications are there? Now, a government body such as the CPSA or the Consumer Product Safety Act tells you exactly what kind of certificate you need to have for a specific directive. Put it simple, right? For example, the REACH directive, which is under the GPSD legislation, so basically the umbrella legislation, says, for example, that a certain product is not allowed to have a certain amount of chemicals inside this product. So for example, cadmium or lead or mercury. So you as an importer, before you import your product, you need to have a certificate or a test report which is issued by a third-party inspection company, for example, that those people have tested your product and the product does not contain a certain value of these chemicals, which is according to this REACH directive. So for example, you are not allowed to have a certain amount of cadmium or mercury or lead in your product as per the REACH directive. With that being said, there are certifications and marks that you have to have. Then there are certifications and marks that are good to have. And there are certifications and marks, for example, that are recommended. So for example, the CE directive says that a certain product has to meet a certain standard. So you need to always comply with the CE directive. But for example, a GS certificate is not required by law, but is, for example, recommended. Or for example, a FCC certificate is required for certain products in the US, so you need to have it. But for example, a UL certification, which is a certification body for electronics, issues marks or seals that are good to have and help you in terms of your exposure to the customer. If they see, for example, oh, this product has a UL certificate, customers feel safer, right? So these are, for example, seals or marks that are recommended or good to have. So who and how are these certificates issued? Now, these certificates are not issued by the factory themselves. They are issued by a third-party company, for example, SGS or TUV or Intertek or Kima and so on and so forth. Suppliers can issue self-declaration certificates if you want, if they believe that their product meets the requirement. But that does not mean that you can use this self-declaration to show to customs or government bodies and that may be enough. No, it's not actually, because if you want to be on the safe side, you want to have a test certificate issued by a third party which is verified. Because anyone can issue a certificate, for example. Well, not every certificate. For example, you cannot issue a GS certificate or a UL certificate by yourself or by the supplier, because these are issued by third-party companies, like I said, SGS, TUV, and so on. So again, this is not a self-certification, is not evidence that a certain product complies to laws and regulations. Now, as I said, real certificates are issued by third parties like SGS, TUV, and so on, or government agencies, for example, the FDA in the US. These certificates are actual evidence that your product complies to a certain standard or directive or legislation in your country. And this serves as a support for you if someone claims that your product may not meet regulations. An actual certificate issued from these third parties is actual evidence that you comply to these laws. A self-declaration, as I mentioned in point 1, is not an evidence or does not verify that your product complies to certain standards or laws, because again, a self-declaration can be issued by any supplier or even by yourself. So what's the workflow on issuing certificates? Usually you need to find out what kind of regulation or what kind of standard your product needs to have. And normally you can ask your supplier in China if he has this certain certificate or if he complies to this certain standard or law. Now, if he does not, he needs to you need to give him the directive or, for example, the legislation or the standard that his product needs to comply to. And then he needs to take the sample of your product and send it to a third-party testing laboratory. This testing laboratory then will test this product in terms of raw material, but also in terms of functionality, and it will be tested according to the standards and laws that the governing authorities, like for example the FDA, give them. If the requirements are met while testing, the third party or the government agency will issue the certificate to the supplier. Now, in some cases, these certificates can be valid for a year. Some of them never expire, and some of them are maybe only valid for 6 months, for example. Now, once the supplier has tested the product and gets the certificate, he can deliver it to you in form of a PDF, for example, that you can then provide to government authorities once you're importing your product. So you don't really need to show this certificate right away, and you may not even be asked by governing authorities, or if you're selling on Amazon, you may not even be asked, but it's always good to have the certificate, at least as a PDF soft copy somewhere on your computer. So what does your product have to meet legally? Most countries have official websites where you can research these things. I know they are very complicated and it's a maze and it's very difficult to understand and how you can actually find out like what your product needs to meet in terms of standards and laws. But you can find these out from actual government authorities or bodies. On the other hand, also if you visit importdojo.com on my blog, you will find that for many product categories I have a detailed blog post on what the specific product category, for example household products, textiles or electronic, needs to meet, so it will help you understand. So just visit importdojo.com. I'll also put it down below in the comment section so you can find it there. Number 5, do you really need to have all the certificates? Because, for example, a certain product may need to have 3 or 4 different certificates or needs to meet 2 or 3 different standards. The simple answer is yes and no. The good news first, no, you don't need to have all certificates or requirement. When, for example, a testing laboratory tells you you need the REACH certificate, you need the FCC report, you need FDA, whatever, and so on. Just keep in mind, these companies, they make money by selling you tests and testing your product and issuing certificates. So again, as I said in the beginning, some certifications or some directives and legislations have to be met by law. Others can be self-declared. So in most cases, it would suffice if you actually issue a self-declaration, at least for some certain standards, but not always. So let me explain. First of all, you need to have a good relationship with your supplier. That means that if you contact a new supplier, for example, and you tell them, look, this product has to meet this certain standard or regulation, and I need this and this certificate, and they actually have it, which would be the ideal situation, that's great. If not, and you have to explain to your supplier what a certain legislation or directive is, and they have no idea what they are, this is usually not a very good sign, because you don't want to educate your supplier on your specific country regulation or law. For example, if, for example, a supplier has had a lot of business in the US, usually they would understand what their product needs to meet in terms of regulations and laws. But for example, if your supplier's main country is Bangladesh or India or South Africa, and they have no idea what legislations or laws are in Europe or in the United States, I would not recommend to work with such a supplier. Having said that, if your supplier does have certifications, sometimes they do not have certification for each of their own product, but they may have a certification for at least the raw material that is tested according to some specific chemicals in the product, like I mentioned earlier, cadmium, lead, mercury, and so on and so forth. So what you need to do is you need to decide, is my product potentially dangerous, or is it a very simple product? So for example, if you do not have a certification from your supplier for a specific product, again, you need to say, okay, I have a very simple product, so there's not a lot of risk involved if I sell this product, or maybe I have a very difficult product, for example, electronic product, a heater with 2000 watt or 120 volt that could essentially burn the whole house down. So you need to differentiate between those two things. You also need to consider that certificate costs money, and usually if the supplier does not have a certificate, they would not pay for the certificate. I'll get to that in a little bit, but let me explain, for example, in two different products. Now let's say you have a very simple product. Let's say, for example, a solar garden light. Now the solar garden light costs maybe $1 or $1.50, and technically it needs to have the CE, the RoHS, the REACH, or in the US maybe even a FCC certification. But obviously for a $1 product, and if you order 1,000 units and you have a total order value of $1,000 US, a REACH, RoHS, FCC certificate could cost upwards to $1,000 US. So you do not want to invest that kind of money, especially if you're just starting out with this product and you just want to test the product, right? So you don't want to overinvest too much. And again, we need to differentiate between a simple product. So let's say with the solar garden light. There's really no battery involved because it's solar powered. Yes, there is a rechargeable battery inside, but it's not really a dangerous battery or anything like that. Also, there is just a little bit of plastic maybe, or a bit of stainless steel if you have a stainless steel product. So it's not really a very risky product that could burn down, right? So if your supplier, for example, does not have certificates for this product, but he has worked with, for example, the US or Europe before, so they kind of know the standards and laws there, and maybe some of the material has been tested for the chemicals that I mentioned earlier, but they do not have the full certificate, that would be suffice for me to issue a self-declaration, for example, a CE, REACH, or even an FCC self-declaration, just stating that my product is conforming to the standards and laws in my specific home country. But let's take a complicated product, for example, let's say what I said earlier, a small fan or heater, which comes with a plug, so there's electricity involved, right? So for example, for the US, you may need a FCC certificate, a REACH certificate, maybe even electromagnetic compatibility certificate or EMC for European Union. And this is potentially a risky product, right? So if you sell it, you as a seller, you want to make sure that your product is compliant, because you don't want to cause any trouble. You don't want anyone to tip over this fan or heater, like children, for example, and it could burn down the whole house. So, and for example, a fan heater has a tip over switch inside. So you want to make sure the electronic or the components inside your product are really compliant with laws. So in this case, if a supplier does not have a certain certificate, I would not work with the supplier. And if I want to work with the supplier because he's generally a good supplier, for example, then I would ask him to send a sample to a test laboratory and issue a test report or certificate for me. So in that case, I would insist on a certification on a product. Now, sometimes you do not need to have a certificate for the whole product, for example, but you could have, for example, a certificate for the components inside or the raw material, and so each component would have a certain certification or standard. That would also suffice for me to say, okay, this product has been tested for several components, but the whole product itself may not have a full certification. This would be fine for me, right? But again, simple product and very difficult or very dangerous product, you need to differentiate. So that you understand this question, do you really have to have all the certificates? Yes, you should have all the certificates as proof that your product can really comply to all the laws, but sometimes it doesn't make sense to have all the certificates, especially if you're just starting out or certificate costs are very high, and if your product is very simple, you may not need it. But for example, in a second, if your product sells well and you imported the product with a self-declaration or at least some partial certification from the supplier, it would make sense that if you reorder this product in the future, that you would later on get a full certification for your product. So, which brings us to point number 6, how does everyone else do it without certification? You may have heard on Facebook groups or on Amazon seller groups that people never heard of certification and they just import their products by air, for example, or air shipment, and these things don't get checked at customs. And usually that is the case for very small shipments. For example, let's say you have a 50 kilo shipment or a 150 kilo shipment, and if you use Air Express or a courier like DHL or UPS, these things usually get waved through unless it's a very specific product that needs, for example, a FDA certification or a REACH certificate. But normally these small shipments go through. But if you take, for example, big retailers like Walmart or Sears or Carrefour in France or Metro in Germany, these companies do not dare to risk to be in a newspaper tomorrow if something happens with their product. So they usually have all the certificates for their product. And I know this because I used to work for a large European buying office in Hong Kong. So we had a specific quality control department where we were doing nothing else, or where they were doing nothing else all day than checking certificates and making sure that the product is according to regulations. But coming back, yes, some importers do not have certificates at all, or they self-declare because maybe they have simple products and not dangerous products, and some importers don't even know about regulations. Or if some YouTube guru tells you about don't worry, just buy from Alibaba, ship it through air and everything will be okay, these guys don't even know that there are certain certifications and laws that apply to your country. So yes, they can do it without certification, but they may get caught. So I don't recommend this route. So make sure that you understand what certifications and requirements you need when you import to your country from the very beginning. So let's talk about general costs. A CE or EMC certificate, which stands for electromagnetic compatibility, can cost up to, let's say, $200-300 US. A low voltage directive certificate, for example, for lighting or lamps, can cost anywhere from $500 to $600 US. A REACH or FCC certificate can also cost anywhere from $150 to $400 US. This all depends on what kind of third-party company that you use. Then we get maybe 2 marks or safety seals that are good to have. Let's, for example, GS in Germany can cost up to $3,000 or $4,000 US. Or a full FDA certification or UL certificate can cost also anywhere from $800 to $1,500 US. Now you might be wondering who pays for these certificate costs. If you work with a supplier that has business in your country, it is very likely that they have certifications or test reports for the product from previous customers. But maybe there is a new regulation, or maybe there is an update to the regulation, and the supplier certificate is based on the old directive, which has not been updated maybe, or is being updated, but the test report has not been updated. Now, normally it's in the interest of the supplier to have up-to-date certifications, because when customers ask for them, they can just send it to them as proof, right? But again, remember, many suppliers have hundreds of products. So they can't have certifications for all of their products, and especially if they develop a new product, they can't afford to test all the different regulations from hundreds of countries, right? Because then they would likely go bankrupt very soon, and they can't have all certifications for each country, right? So it usually depends on if a supplier is very active in the country where you're importing to, or if he's not even familiar with it. So normally the supplier will pay for basic reports or test certificates for the country that he's regularly exporting to, right? But if he does not have a certain certification, normally the buyer or you would pay for the certificate, especially if you insist on having this certificate. Remember again, differentiate between simple and maybe dangerous products. So if you have a simple product, you could, and the supplier does not have a certificate, you could self-declare based on your experience with the supplier or based on his experience with the country that he usually exports to, right? But normally, again, you would pay for a full certificate. What you can do is you can suggest a 50-50 split, meaning that you would pay 50% of the cost and the supplier would pay 50% of the cost, which is advantageous for him because he can also sell this product to other customers, maybe in your country or different countries. I know that maybe not in your interest, but if you want to save costs on paying for certificates, this would be the ideal way to go. Now, where can you save money? As I've said, self-declaration or letter of conformities that you can issue by yourself. Now, in the comments below, in the description, I will post a link for you where you can download these templates, also on my website, but also on official government websites, where you can download forms and templates that you can use to self-declare your product. But remember, before you do something like this, you need to make sure that your supplier's product really does conform with all the standards and laws in your country. If he has no experience with your country, it's very likely that he does not comply with all those standards and laws. So you need to either educate your supplier or you need to find a supplier who can comply with all these standards and laws. But again, some cases you can self-declare your product safely, especially if it's a low-risk product like a solar lamp or a salad bowl out of plastic, for example. Then you might be wondering, are the certificates for the European Union the same as in the US? And the simple answer is no, they're not. So they, like I said earlier, there are different standards. But it means also, for example, if your supplier, if you're in the European Union and your supplier has worked with countries such as UK, because it's also not in the EU anymore, or with customers in America, in the United States, it means they have a certain standard of quality for their products, right? So they do understand laws and certifications. Or for example, if you are in the US and your supplier has all kind of certificates for the German market, which has a very strict standard or very strict directives and laws already, this is usually a good sign that your supplier has high quality products and understands the market. But you cannot use this German certificate for the US market, and vice versa. You cannot use a US certificate such as FDA or FCC for the German market. Actually, that is not 100% accurate because you can use FDA also in Germany, but for some US certificates, they are not valid in the European Union. But again, if the supplier has certain certificates from a high requirement country, then it's very safe to say that the supplier that you can work with the supplier. Then maybe, as I said before, you can get the supplier to test for you. Like I said, you could suggest a 50-50 split, or you could suggest to him, look, if he pays for these certificate costs, there are many companies in the specific country that you are maybe importing to that he could sell these products to. Maybe you can have some exclusivity agreement that you will sell on Amazon for him or in an online shop, and he may sell these products to the retailers. In that case, he might be willing to pay for these certificates for you. Then another question is, why do some suppliers have no certificates at all? This is a good question, but as I said before, remember, if a supplier works for a certain market and has never sold to a certain different market, they may have no certificates for that specific market at all. Or some suppliers have no certificates at all for any country. This is usually a sign that this is a very new supplier, they have no experience, so you should stay away from these kind of suppliers. But in general, most suppliers have certificates for specific countries already, but it doesn't mean because your supplier doesn't have any certificate for your country, it doesn't mean he's incapable or he's incompetent. It just means he's never worked with your country before, but maybe he's willing to. So if you educate him a little bit, or if you connect him with a third-party company like TUV or SGS that can educate him, this could be a way for you to work with the supplier. But again, if the supplier has no understanding of any market or any requirements at all, this is not a good sign, so stay away. But if he's very proactive and he wants to work with you, he wants to sell in your country, I would be willing to educate the supplier and help him to get the certificates for me. But again, if the supplier has no certificate at all, that either means he's very new or he's just testing the market with some of his products and he just doesn't want to pay the certificate costs. All right, so this is a brief overview for you on certifications, directives, laws and regulations, where you can get them, who pays for them, and so on. And if you're interested in this, I've also posted a link in the description below where you can have this in a written format. And on my blog, you will also find a lot of formats. If you do like this video, please hit the like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell notification so that you're always updated when I post my new or next videos. With that being said, stay safe and happy sourcing.